The billionaire had been standing in nothing but his underwear, briefs, maroon. Peering through the window of the car sent to get him, Yorick had wondered if the man matched even his undergarments to his boots. If the briefs would make his eyes look a little red-tinged, too. Or would his irises seem burnt around the edges, picking up the deep tan of Bazarov's bare chest, belly, legs. Or just graze the lake, stretched out behind the nearly naked man. It was the kind of summer day when the northern world feels the need to remind its people that they're never far from winter. Gusts chopped the lake, blew off the water, tore through the trees, shook the driver's suit as he opened Yorick's door. Standing up into it was like stepping into a slap. Yorick squinted past the chain-link fence, the open gate, to the billionaire standing there at the edge of the loading dock. Bazarov, his boss. The night that Yorick had told Zenaida how he'd gotten his promotion, that was what she'd said. Your boss? And hearing the question in her voice, he'd been unable to keep at bay the ones that had been hounding him. Lying beside each other on the bed, beneath their drying post-celebration sweat, they tried to imagine what lay inside the she-bear's mind, what a man like that could possibly want from a man like Yorick. Because, when Zenaida said it, it seemed so clear. His boss hadn't handpicked one of his many thousand workers, brought him to a mansion, made him tea, just to impart a bit of good news, indulge a tender heart. Maybe he wanted a local's perspective on Petropavlovsk. Maybe he wanted an infiltrator among his ranks. A spy, Zenaida had said, smiling. Or, shrugging her small shoulders, maybe just a friend. But why, Yorick objected, would he choose me? And her smile widening, his wife had raised her eyebrows. Maybe more than a friend, before slipping back beneath the sheets. Now, his boss was gesturing, bare arms scooping at bare sides, flinging out, almost as if miming the act of treading water. Through the man's wind-whipped hair, Yorick could just see Bazarov was shouting something he couldn't quite make out, then nearly did, was on the verge of understanding, had understood just enough to wish he didn't, when the driver spoke up and made it clear. Take off your clothes. Yorick stared at the driver, then at the nearly naked billionaire. Not because he thought there was anything to his wife's joke that night, but because he couldn't help but wonder if the dock workers would. Bazarov had selected to strip not where the old folks used to sunbathe on the rocks, not at the gravel beach where Yorick used to launch his brother off his back, but smack at the edge of the wharf. Cranes loomed above, swung cabled crates, slabs of steel. Mammoth warehouses hunkered beneath their rusting roofs. Half-built ships rippled with the movement of their crews. All around the dock workers milled, shouted to each other, tried not to stare. For a second, Yorick took it all in. Then he handed the driver his gloves, his hard hat, and stripped. When he reached Bazarov, the man was grinning so wide his goatee seemed shrunken. His chest was covered in fine blonde curls, the bronze skin beneath all goose-fleshed. Yorick's own chest hairs felt as if the chill wind might try to yank them out. Cold? Bazarov asked. Yorick shook his head. And, as if picking up the movement, Bazarov began to shake his own. Just a little. A shiver rippled up his neck, and then a little more, so his locks began to tremble, until his entire face was quivering, his ears, his cheeks, his whole body tense, every muscle flexing, his head vibrating as if hit by a seizure. He stared at Yorick. His lips burst into shaking. The sound he let out was half horse's neigh, half motorboat. When he stopped, his eyes were wet with held-back laughter. His voice was bright with glee. You know what you need? Yorick started to shake his head, thought better of it. A paddle, Bazarov said. He said it with such a shot of joy that Yorick's body jerked, as if his bare skin was anticipating a smack. But instead, the man bent down, came up holding what looked to Yarick like a pair of double-headed oars, one of which Bazarov thrust at him. He had never been in a kayak. Over the pier side, tied to the dock, there were two of them, long red missiles of boats. Bazarov climbed down, got in, untied his rope, shoved off, all while telling Yarick about stirrups and rudders and steering. And by the time the man raised his paddle above his head, shouting over his shoulder something about holding it in such a way so far apart, Yarick was still trying to figure out how to get in. "What about this rubber thing?" he said. From the front of his kayak he heard 3 thumps, Bazarov tapping the boat's nose, pat, 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 and looked up to see the man already shooting away. For a long time, Yarick followed the figure so distant, he could just make out the gold of the man's hair, the white paddle blades rising and falling far ahead. They looked like seagull wings, the billionaire swift and sure on the surface as the birds in the air. Sometimes it even seemed the man was slaloming, playing with the waves. The same that slapped the side of Yarick's boat, beat at him through the bottom, tried to shove him back. Hacking at them, breathing spray, he fought the wind that tried to grab his boat, spin it around, almost wished it would. He'd keep paddling, back to the dock, the car, climb in, slam the doors shut. Instead, he shouted at each cold slosh of water, sometimes at the man up ahead. As far as he could tell, the billionaire never once looked back. Then, he was too far away to see even if he had. The paddles were distant flashes of light, Bazarov barely a blur between them. And for what seemed to an even longer time, Yarick followed that. His shoulders burned, his back ached. He wished he'd worn his work gloves. Ahead, the other kayak had become a spot of red. He stopped paddling, his breath tearing up his chest, his boat seesawing on the waves. The other boat was gone. They had been staying far enough into the lake to be out of the algae, but in sight of the shore, the distant line shifting from city to suburbs to the ceaseless glinting strip where their ranzeria came to Otseva's edge. And he knew he could go on, keep the shore to his left, meet Bazarov eventually. Eventually, the man would come paddling back. He could almost see his grin, the way the man had mocked him, shivering on the dock. Nothing of friendship in that act. Even the idea of it seemed as foolish now in the cold wind of the gray day as his wife's insinuation had that night. The waves knocked at the boat like a memory of the man's hand, 3 small pats. Nothing friendly in that touch. The wind blew lake spray across his back and brought a memory with it. The way Dima, crouched on his shoulders, waiting to dive into the lake, used to signal he was ready to be launched. And Yarick, underwater, would echo the count back with his fingers against his brother's feet. Tap, tap, tap. Swaying there on the surface of the lake, his own surface stretched tight from the cold, he wanted those boys back. But he knew the only way to reclaim some place for them, to set aside some corner of the world where they could return to, was to go forward. That was what his brother didn't seem to understand, what their uncle had been unable to see, what their father had been unwilling to. When all the world was moving ahead, just holding on was falling behind. Striving to stay the same was the same as giving up. The paddle had torn his hands, and his shoulders felt ready to rip right off, and his teeth were clenched against their chattering when he finally caught up with the billionaire. They had gone so far for so long that the shore had shed the glass. To Yarick's left, the land was a long strip of dark green trees. To his right, Lake Otseva opened up, gray to the horizon. In between, the red kayak floated. Bazarov had stretched out, his feet crossed over the boat's long nose, the paddle resting on his chest like the bar of a bench press. "You know," Bazarov said, "the last time I went kayaking with someone was with Pavel." With, Yarick thought? Went with? He wanted to shove the man's boat, but he just waited, his kayak bobbing, the ache oscillating in his muscles, the rucked skin on his hands starting to stiffen up. Far out on the lake, one of the oligarch's berg-sized ships droned. From the shore, almost too far away to hear, there came the low wash of wind through firs. And damned if he was going to ask who Pavel was. That, the man said, goggles covering his eyes with reflections of the sky, was a long time ago. And also it was on the Black Sea. Have you ever been to the Black Sea? No, Yarick said. To the Caspian? I've never been anywhere. Once to Moscow when I was on the Caspian, Bazarov went on. They have one of these, but theirs is up on dry land. One of what? Slowly, the rest of his body staying still, Bazarov turned the paddle parallel to him, slid it down into the hole for which he'd drawn his legs, left it sticking up at a low slant. He let go, lay there, blades swaying against the sky. Have you ever heard, Bazarov said, of the Caspian sea monster? Then he rolled off the boat, slipped down the side, and splashed into the lake, where, his hair floating like a patch of golden algae, his back like the top of a rock, his maroon rear, his legs, his kicking feet, he disappeared. For a moment, the water he'd churned shook Yarick's boat. Then that was gone too. Carefully, Yarick dipped a blade, drew a little closer to where Bazarov had been. Staring down, he could see browns and greens below, thought he caught a glimpse of something pale moving in the dark. Then, nothing. The depth, the murk, the silhouette of his own reflection. He looked over at the other boat, listening lazily on the waves, the paddle knocking. For the first time since that long ago night in the stolen rowboat, he felt the enormity of the lake, the power rippling across its surface, the unknowable everything beneath. Something broke the surface. He heard it like a seabird landing next to his boat, and when he jerked around to look, there was Bazarov, treading, breathing hard. He lifted the goggles. They rested on his forehead like a second pair of gleaming eyes. His own eyes were the color of the lake, quiet, almost contemplative. Well, this is it. The man shook his head, flung his wet hair from his face. Each time I forget what a beast it is, 100 meters long from head to tail, stretched out on the bottom like some huge eel. Yarick leaned over a little to look, a tug on his paddle, Bazarov drawing himself closer to the boat. It's down there, the man said. Where? Right under us. Mr. Bazarov, Yarick started. The man made a face as if he'd been hurt. Baz, Yarick said, what are we talking about? And Baz smiled. Give me your paddle, he said. Hanging an arm over it, he reached up, yanked his goggles off. Really? You've never heard of it? I don't know what it is. Then, Bazarov held out the goggles. Swim down and see. The Caspian sea monster. Somewhere in the far reaches of his mind, he had heard of it, but he couldn't see anything. The water was too clouded with particles of plant life, rotting away in the lake, too murky with tannins, stirred up silt, and churning of the waves. He could feel them moving above him, and then he couldn't, and his hands singing, his arms aching, his lungs so full of air it fought his strokes, he swam down. Down towards the ever-darkening depths, the water getting colder and colder, and the light from above leaving him until it seemed he was swimming into nothing but black. Had it been a thing out of his old uncle's fairy tales? A creature from the fables his father had carved on his boat? He could almost see his father's mouth, the black mustache, the hole between the open lips, saying the words, could almost hear them. By the time he saw it through the murk, he was so close, a few seconds more and he might have touched its back. That was what he thought was the blackness of the water beneath him. That was what had seemed the unseeable bottom of the lake. That was how big it was. His arms stopped moving, his legs stilled, and for a second he was suspended there, staring down at what looked like a blue whale's back, so wide he could barely make out where it sloped away at the sides, so long he couldn't see the beginning or end of it at all. Only a few places where scales seemed to glint, where the slime that he sensed smothering the rest of it must have washed away. Then his lungs burst. The last of his air erupted from his mouth. His chest crushed in on itself, and he was kicking, thrashing for the surface, away from whatever was down there. As he flailed upwards, he kept his head bent, his eyes on it, his own voice telling him it wouldn't move. Couldn't. Wasn't it alive? But was that a shiver? A ripple? His sight blurred, the goggles pressing into his sockets, and then his breath was gone, and his arms were unable to work, and the lake water burst into his nose, filled his throat. For a second, he didn't know what grabbed him. Then, somewhere in his skull came the realization they were hands. Hands clasped around his chest, arms beneath his own face in the air, a body against him, its breath. Bazarov. "What did you think?" the man said, breathing hard to Yarick's ear. "That it was going to eat you." Yarick flapped his arm, coughed. Bazarov's laugh brought him around as much as anything else. "What the fuck is that?" he said, and kicking, "I'm okay," tried to pull out of the man's grip. "You sure?" "What the fuck is it? Not missing any toes? Fuck off." And Bazarov was laughing again, heaving him up onto one of the boats, hauling himself the rest of the way, and Yarick remembered who he was talking to. He lay, flopped over the kayak, belly breathing against the hard plastic, arms clutching the side. "I'm sorry," he said. There, in front of him, the billionaire, the she-bear, his boss, treaded water, looking up into his eyes. "You want to know what the fuck it is?" "I'm sorry," Yarick repeated. But Bazarov only beamed. "I call it the Serpent of Asteva. The Americans called it, the one they saw in grainy pictures, the Caspian Sea Monster. But what it is an ectronoplan." "Wait." Bazarov gripped Yarick's forearms with his hands. "I know." He held on, still treading with his legs. "I know, Cossack! What the fuck is that?" On the way back, he told him how over half a century ago, the Bureau for Hydrofoil Design had built the first. 500 tons, 100 meters long, a colossal cross between airplane and ship, whose 8 head-mounted engines would hurl it forward at such speeds, its wing-like fins would compress the air against the water surface and give it lift. How, at 700 kilometers per hour, 20 meters above the sea, it would rise out of the realm of hydrofoils into one that existed only for it. How, though eventually they'd be built down on the Caspian, the prototype was tested on Asteva first. Then, to keep it from the spying eyes of satellites, sunk. The first creature of its kind, a genius's life work, and all these years buried in the lake. As if, Bazarov said, he was one day to collapse the entire oranzeria, let it simply disappear into hundreds of hectares of weeds, woods grown up, a forest hiding the great glass sea. "You," Bazarov told him, "are the first person I brought to see it." They were paddling side by side, the wind now coming from behind, the waves helping them along. And maybe it was his relief at that, maybe just the rhythm they were in, blades lifting and falling in synchronicity, but Yarick glanced at the man beside him and asked, "What about Pavel?" Bazarov's paddle blades dipped, rose, dipped again. From the shore there came the distant boom of trees being felled, the first gleam farther up of the oranzeria's glass, and then, "Stop paddling." Yarick watched his blade streak by Bazarov's stilled one. The man gave the water one more stroke to bring him back beside. They floated, still slipping forward over the waves, the wind still pushing them. "Give me your paddle," Bazarov said. And as he took hold of the near blade, he slid Yarick his own. "Hold both." Reaching past his lap into the kayak's hole, he brought out a square of something. Shiny, crinkled plastic. Watching Bazarov unfold it, Yarick realized it was a tarp. And when they tied each corner to a pole and held the poles between them and opened them up, it became a sail, and their kayaks sailboats. The wind, a gale, the lake shot by. Between them, the tarp billowed. Their arms shook. The wave spray blew over their bows and wet their faces, and Yarick could feel it sting all over his cheeks. And he squinted into it, let it rush his teeth. Beside him, Bazarov let out a whoop. Through his whipping hair, his eyes glinted at Yarick. "The Yaroslavoplan!" he shouted. "The Bazoplan!" Yarick shouted back. "The Bazoslavoplan!" And they blew across the lake, the surface a blur, the waves machine-gunning against the bottoms of their boats. "Pavel," Barazov shouted, "was always too afraid to do this. Afraid of everything. A picture of the bear. Me and the boar. On my desk, who was even too afraid to take it. A picture of a dead boar. The dog handler had to take it. And I had flown him all the way up, brought him on the hunt, hoped to make a hunter out of him." Bazarov's eyes held on him, seemed to take him in, appraise him, and then they left him, and the man gazed straight ahead again. "This winter," Bazarov shouted, "we'll go together. Along the northern shore, I have a hunting lodge there. Those woods grow boars the size of bulls. You with one Colt 45, me with the other. None of this big game rifle bullshit. Cowboy," he shouted, "you haven't lived till you've seen a couple 100 kilos of boar charging at you through the snow, and nothing between its tusk and your balls but the barrel of a 150-year-old pistol." Bazarov laughed, and the sound flung away by the wind Yarick could feel gusting against the tarp, feel in his throbbing hands, in the way all his skin felt whipped to life. And flying across the lake, the glass now shining on the shore, Otsteva stretching out on the side all the way to the horizon, he knew who Pavel was. But it didn't feel to Yarick like Bazarov was trying to turn him into a replacement for a son. It didn't feel like his boss wanted him to become some sort of father. In that moment, Yarick felt, instead, what it might have been like to have had an older brother. Thank you.